Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck. And if you watched last time, and if you haven't watched last time, you might want to look at that because what happens is that Father Time hangs himself and his two baby siblings. And so that's the main thing that happens that is going to, in a way, reverse these characters of Jude and Sue. Jude starts off on a very religious track. He loses his faith along the way. And then Sue starts off as kind of the atheist who now, after this tragedy, is going to cling to faith, but not in a way that's positive, in a way that is punishing. So what you have to do is think about what Hardy is saying through Sue's actions about religion. I mean, he seems to be pointing out that religion, it has like two waves. And one is that people like to feel self-righteous. The ego likes to feel self-righteous. And so, therefore, I'm following these things because I'm a good person. I'm a good Christian. The other wave is completely out of fear. I'm going to do this because God is after me. He's punishing me. And this is the way Sue feels about losing her kids, that this is God's punishment. And that's nothing new. I mean, even in when I was talking about Job, and he loses everything, and his friends who come by to comfort him, eventually the conversation goes to, well, you must have done something wrong. I mean, God wouldn't just do this to you. And the thing is, God isn't doing anything to anybody. This was Father Time's decision. This is what he did. It was a very unnatural thing to do. But in his mind, it was going to solve a problem. That they were a problem. And that he's getting his way out of it. It doesn't really have anything to do with God. But the way Sue is interpreting it is a personal, almost revengeful, angry God. Look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you so miserable and suffer so much that you have to submit. Now remember, the inscription of this book is "The letter killeth." And that Hardy purposely leaves out the second half of that verse, which is, but the Spirit lives. There's no idea of the New Testament, of Christianity, with what Sue is coming to. It's not, Romans 8, it says, therefore there is no condemnation. And he talks about grace. And there's forgiveness. The main reason someone should be a Christian is out of love, which comes from the Spirit. But in this world, they don't live by that. They live by the law, and that's also the way society sees things. So you see these things kind of antagonistic to each other. The religion and the right thing to do. So let me just read. This is, kind of the aftermath of many conversations that Sue and Jude are going to have. But basically, she's going to want to definitely get out of this relationship. And she tells Jude, we must conform, she said mournfully. All the ancient wrath of power above us has been vented upon us, his poor creatures, and we must submit. There's no choice. We must. It is no use fighting against God. It is only against man and senseless circumstances, said Jude. True, she murmured. What have I been thinking of? I'm getting as superstitious as a savage. But whoever or whatever our foe may be, I am cowed into submission. I have no more fighting strength left, no more enterprise. I am beaten, beaten. We are made a spectacle unto the world, and to angels, and to men. I'm always saying that now. I feel the same. What shall we do? You are in work now, but remember, it may only be because our history and relations are not absolutely known. Possibly if they knew our marriage had not been formalized, they would turn you out of your job, as they did in Albrickham. I hardly know. Perhaps they would hardly do that. However, I think we ought to make it legal now, as soon as you're able to go out. You think we ought? Certainly. So notice how satirizing this is. We must conform. There's God's wrath and this power above us that's been vented on us. And it reminds me of almost like Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he talks about how we're just like these spiders on a string, and God could let go, and he wants to let go at any time. That you are not even worthy to be born. So there's definitely an extremism to this. And the other thing that she starts, as she talks about being submissive, she goes back to Richard Phillotson. Maybe that's where it started. Where we started to unravel. This is where the first sin. And it's easy to feel that way after you've been divorced, especially when you're made to feel that way. Going back to Father Time and what his decision, I was saying that it's not God, but there is a part of society that is, kind of society's being the villain. It's not letting this woman in with her children. It's not helping the poor. People do that. People do that to each other. People cause suffering to each other, especially when we don't have charity and don't care for one another. But see how that is in opposition of the legalism. Is she really a married woman? Can't have any part of that without thinking about, having some mercy for the kids. So the conversation goes back to Phillotson, and she said, she should have left him just the same, even if Jude hadn't, interfered. She says, as to ourselves, the fact that our not having entered into a legal contract is the saving feature of our union. We have thereby avoided insulting, as it were, the solemnity of our first marriages. So what she's saying is, we haven't violated our first marriages. This is a good thing, because if we had, that would have been, adultery. And so Jude says, solemnity? Jude looked at her with some surprise and grew conscious that she was not the Sue of earlier time. Yes, she said with a little quiver in her words, I have dreadful fears, a dreadful sense of my own insolence of action. I have thought that I am still his wife. Whose? Richard's. Good God, dearest, why? Oh, I can't explain. Only the thought comes to me. It is your weakness, a sick fancy, without reason or meaning. Don't let it trouble you. Sue sighed uneasily. And he starts to see that there's definitely, they've changed places, which is something that happens in tragedy. There's the reversal. So if you talked about this in an essay and you talked about the ending, you would have to talk about the reversal of the two. Let me just read this part. There was this change in him that did not often go to any service at the churches now. One thing troubled him more than any other, that Sue and himself had mentally traveled in opposite directions since the tragedy. Events which had enlarged his own views of life, laws, customs, and dogmas, had not operated in the same manner on Sue's. She was no longer the same as in the independent days when her intellect played like lambent lightning over conventions and formalities, which he at the time respected, though he did not now. So something is also the way that one of the reasons why I'm saying he's satirizing this is just the manner of Sue's nature is changed, and her intellect being, at once, very open-minded and curious and, questioning. That's okay. That's who you are. That's your nature. But what Sue is thinking is that I am this creature that, is bad. She always talks about that there's all this badness in me. It almost sounds like Calvinistic, and that I'm unworthy. But notice that he says it enlarged Jude's mind. What happens when you face something incredibly tragic is that the sorrow almost becomes like the sublime. It's awful, but notice the word awe. Like, oh my God, that's awful. But awful can also mean full of awe. Like, this is putting me on a completely different level and perspective. And, it's very hard for people who've been through the loss of a child or war or something extremely tragic to come back into society, because everything starts to seem frivolous. In a way, it's like going back to that Job lesson. Job says, you don't know what I know. You don't know what this kind of suffering, this kind of sorrow, it brings you to a whole other level of consciousness. And I think that's what he means just by this little bit of insight into Jude's mind, looking at, how small we are in the big, vast scheme of things, how small our problems are. When something like this happens, all those little daily anxieties and worries, it becomes superfluous in the sight of this awful event. But what happens to Sue is it closes her mind. And partly because she blames herself for it happening. You also notice that Sue's language sounds more like martyrdom than living. He asked her, "What are you thinking, little woman?" He asked carelessly. "Oh, I can't tell clearly. I have thought that we have been selfish, careless, even impious in our courses, you and I. Our life has been a vain attempt at self-delight, but self-abnegation is the higher road. We should mortify the flesh, the terrible flesh, the curse of Adam." "Sue," he murmured, "what has come over you?" "We ought to be continually sacrificing ourselves on the altar of duty. But I have always striven to do what has pleased me. I well deserve the scourging I have got. I wish something would take the evil right out of me and all my monstrous errors and my sinful ways. Sue, my own too suffering dear, there's no evil woman in you. Your natural instincts are perfectly healthy, not quite so impassioned perhaps as I could wish, but good and dear and pure. And as I have often said, you are absolutely the most ethereal, least sensual woman I ever knew to exist, without inhuman sexlessness. Why do you talk in such a changed way? We have not been selfish, except when no one could profit by our being otherwise. You used to say that human nature was noble, long-suffering, not vile and corrupt. And at last I thought you spoke truly, and now you seem to take much lower view. And that's what I mean in contrast to opening her mind to this reality. It's closing her mind. And notice that she is talking about, in very legalistic terms, duty. She'll use that word again in a very cringe-worthy way when we get there. And she says, I want a humble heart, a chastened mind. I have never had them yet. You have been fearless, both as a thinker and a feeler, and you deserved more admiration than I gave. I was too full of narrow dogmas at the time to see it. Don't say that, Jude. I wish every fearless word and thought could be rooted out of my history. Self-renunciation, that's everything. I cannot humiliate myself too much. I should like to prick myself all over with pins and bleed out the badness that's in me. Hush, he said, pressing her little face against his breast as if she were an infant. It's bereavement that has brought you to this. Such remorse is not for you, my sensitive plant, which is allusion to Shelley, but for the wicked ones of the earth who never feel it. I ought not stay like this, she murmured, as she had remained in the position a long while. Why not? It's indulgence, still on the same track. But is there anything better on earth that we should love one another? And so he also notices that she starts to go to church, and he says, I smell this weird perfume on you, and it's incense. And actually he calls it an indescribable perfume, which is true if you've ever been into a church where it's almost like a myrrh or something. It really does smell good to me, but it's the purest smell I've ever, encountered. And she says she goes to St. Celius, and this is what she does with her time, which would be a good thing if she found comfort in the spiritual realm, but all she can do is think about how she should be punished. And notice Jude talks about the nature of somebody. Sure, Jesus says, deny thyself, the self, the conception of self, though, the ego, the one who thinks that you're identified with or what you do, that false self, the self of me, of who I am in materialistic terms, not in nature though. And I know that when you grow up in a very legalistic church, which I did when I was very young, the emphasis is always on God's will. What's God's will for your life? And God's will, it sounds like it's a miserable thing, that you should not ever be yourself or use your gifts. And I really think that that's kind of wrong. It wasn't until I became Orthodox that I heard the word synergy, that there's a synergy between you and God, that there's something that you should still be yourself. You should still be what's natural. And then you start to see that as she talks about going back to Richard, she's calling him Richard, to Phillotson. And it doesn't sound natural at all. So she says, I want to tell you something else, Jude. You won't be angry, will you? I have thought a good deal since my babies died. I don't think I ought to be your wife or as your wife any longer. What? But you are, from your point of view. And they talk about, of course, we were afraid of the ceremony. We've heard that a million times. And he says, you are my wife. And she says, I'm not exactly your wife, and I'm not legally your wife. So during this conversation, after he says, my heavens, have we changed places? This is the tragic reversal. Arabella comes to share in her grief. She shows up and, she finds out what happened. She said she could come to the funeral, but thank you for inviting me. No, I couldn't come to the funeral, but I'm glad I found the grave as your trade. And he was my child, and naturally I feel for him. I hope so. We all did. The others weren't mine. I didn't feel so much for, as was natural. Of course, a sigh came from the dark corner where Sue sat. I have often wished that I had mine with me, continued Mrs. Scarlett, Arabella. Perhaps this wouldn't have happened then. But of course I didn't want to take him away from your wife. I'm not his wife, came from Sue. The unexpectedness of her words struck Sue silent. Oh, I beg your pardon, I'm sure, said Arabella. I thought you were. So this is good news for Arabella because she's already been scheming in her mind on how to get Jude back. Because now she's widowed, she's just living with her dad. She really doesn't have any other options. And everything is a very calculated thing with Arabella. So then Sue runs off back to church. There's somebody who lets her in even at night, who has a key, lets her come in. And Jude starts looking for her and goes and finds her there. And she's a little angry at this. I wanted to be alone. It's you're intruding, basically, on me in the church. Now, if Sue felt like she should completely change her ways, I think it would have been very easy for her to live more like a monastic. I don't know that they would accept her as, a nun after everything, but it seems to me like where she wants to be is with God in a church without anybody, else intruding. But instead of taking that route, she says, I've been, with Arabella coming, I've been thinking that she's still your wife, and Phillotson is still mine. And Jude's like, what are you talking about? They mean nothing to us. And she says, yes, dear friend, they are. I see marriage differently now. My baby's been taken from me to show me this. This was their purpose of dying. Arabella's child killing mine was a judgment, a right slaying the wrong. What shall I do? I am such a vile creature, too worthless to mix with ordinary humans. This is terrible, said Jude, verging on tears. It's monstrous and unnatural for you to be so remorseful when you have done no wrong. Oh, you don't know my badness. He returned vehemently. I do. Every atom and drag of it. You made me hate Christianity or mysticism or sacerdotalism or whatever it might be called. If it's that which has caused this deterioration in you, that a woman poet, a woman seer, a woman whose soul shone like a diamond, whom all the wise of the world would have been proud of if they could have known you, should degrade herself like this. I am glad I had nothing to do with divinity. Damn glad, if it's going to ruin you this way. And so here again you have kind of Hardy's satirizing of making the point that a lot of people make against Christianity. She's the example of why I wouldn't do this. But she's not being a good example, And it only reinforces whatever doubts someone like Hardy has. That this is it's unnatural what this could do to a person. And it does make some people fanatical. And that's not okay. There has to be some kind of balance. And he asked, could this possibly be the same girl who I met, let me just read a little bit of this, who mimicked Miss Fontover when she crushed her deities with her heel, and who quoted Gibbon and Shelley and Mill? Where are dear Apollo and dear Venus now? And, she's saying, don't be so cruel to me. Don't bring up all those things that I did. I can't bear it. It cuts me like a knife. And then they have this conversation about, which I'm not going to go over. It's an old conversation about whether she ever really loved him. And then she talks about, how a woman's appetite of being loved, and also the jealousy that she felt towards Arabella, which was kind of true. You saw that every time there was a little bit of a turning point, which, you kind of get the impression that maybe Sue shouldn't be with anybody. Maybe she's one of those people who are not meant to, to be one with another person, but to be herself. So it's the same old argument, and she basically says that she's gonna leave him, that they can't be together anymore. And he says, "Oh, Sue," with a sudden sense of his own danger, "do not do an immoral thing for immoral reasons. You've been my social salvation. Stay with me for humanity's sake. You know what a weak fellow I am. My two arch enemies, my weakness for womankind and my impulse to strong liquor. Don't abandon me to them, Sue, to save your own soul only. They have been kept entirely at distance since you became my guardian angel. Since I have had you, I have been able to go into any temptations of the sort without risk. Isn't my safety worth a little sacrifice of dogmatic principle? I am in terror lest you leave me. It will be with me another case of the pig that was washed turning back to his wallowing in the mire." Sue burst out weeping. "Oh, but you must not, Jude. You won't. I'll pray for you day and night." "Well, never mind. Don't grieve," said Jude generously. "I did suffer, God knows, about you at the time, and now I suffer again, but perhaps not so much as you. The woman mostly gets the worst of it in the long run." And Sue's, concedes she does. The woman does always get the worst of it. So in the next chapter you see, meanwhile, there's Phillotson having the same conversation with his old buddy Gillingham. They mentioned that they had seen, Sue and Jude at the Christminster Remembrance Day. And he gets in the paper and he reads about a strange suicide of stonemasons' children that catches his eye. And he doesn't know who the older boy is. That's a little confusing to him, but he realizes that it's Sue. And he says their cup of sorrow is now full. So then he's walking around and he happens to see Arabella. And he says, "Oh, how do you like walking out this way?" And she tells him that she had just come back from Christminster. And he says, "Oh, how do they bear their terrible affliction?" "In a very strange way, very strange. She don't live with him any longer. I only heard of it as a certainty just before I left, though I had thought things were drifting that way for their manner when I called on them. Not live with her husband? Why, I should have thought 'twould united them more. He's not her husband, after all. She's never really married him, although they have passed as man and wife so long. And now, instead of this sad event, making him hurry up and get the thing done legally, she took in a queer religious way, just as I was in my affliction at losing Carlet. Only hers is more hysterical sort than mine. And she says, so I was told, that she's your wife in the eyes of heaven and the church, yours only, and can't be anybody else's by any act of man. Ah, indeed, separated have they? You see, the eldest boy was mine. Oh, yours. Okay. Alrighty then. This sounds like kind of good news for Phillotson. But notice how Arabella and Phillotson are taking advantage of the situation, both in very different ways. Phillotson wants to right the wrong of his reputation. He wants a second chance, and Arabella wants a chance. She just goes for whatever she needs to do. She will do to survive, because she's a survivor. So, on second thought, he asked about, what is her address? And Arabella happily says, she grimly smiled and gave him the address. So he's going to get in touch with Sue while she's in this very vulnerable state. So Sue and him, send some letters back and forth, and Sue decides to tell Jude that she's going back to Richard. And he says, going back? How can you go? She said, he's going to marry me again. And that for form's sake, it's going to satisfy the world. Everybody's going to be happy now. Then we get back together. And she says, you know what? I am his wife already in the eyes of God. He says, no, you're my wife, in the eyes of God. And she, of course, says no, and says, and if you don't mind me saying so, I think you should take Arabella back. I think that would be the right thing to do. And you see how what students would call cringe-worthy. This is just the thought of it, of them both going back. But that's part of the tragedy. They have to do that. Let me read this. He shook his head hopelessly, his eyes wet. The blow of her bereavement seemed to have destroyed her reasoning faculty. The once keen vision was dimmed. All wrong, he said huskily. Error, perversity, it drives me out of my senses. Do you care for him? Do you love him? I know you don't. It will be a fanatic prostitution. Very interesting combination of words there. Fanatic prostitution. God forgive me, yes, that's what it will be. I don't love him. I must own it in deepest remorse. But I shall try to learn to love him by obeying him. Jude argued, urged, implored, but her conviction was proof against all. It seemed to be the one thing on earth on which she was firm, and that her firmness in this had left her tottering in every other impulse and wish she possessed. So they say goodbye, and he says, goodbye, my mistaken wife. Goodbye. And I'm going to end it there. It's probably going to take me 2 more videos to finish this. So there's just a lot. I don't want to end up going too long and exhaust both of us. So at any rate, I'll see you next time. All right. Thank you.